Thank you for the warm introduction, and really happy to be here today and share with you all a little bit of my work on using AI and OR techniques for social impact, and then time permitting, hopefully at the end also go back to how some of the challenges we've identified in addressing these problems also inspired methodological advances in AI. So at USC, as Sarah mentioned, I co-direct the Center for AI in Society, whose mission is to advance the scholarship and application of AI for the well-being of vulnerable communities, both human and other species. And we really focus on advancing responsible AI in partnership with community stakeholders, organizations, and policymakers. So we share this kind of enthusiasm and commitment to try to work on problems that are well-grounded and in partnerships to make sure that they address the real pain points that will make a difference in the real world. And so within the center, we've broadly organized the different research projects and collaborations we have in 3 teams: health and well-being, environment, and homelessness. And I will try today to give you several examples within spanning some of these domains. So in my own work, I have focused on using AI for conservation, for habitat and biodiversity conservation, but also more recently on disaster resilience, in particular thinking about mitigation planning across lifeline infrastructure against disasters such as wildfires, floods, and earthquakes. And then finally, climate change and its impacts on human displacement, species displacement, energy, and health. And what's the common thread between these many different application domains is that they involve the design of policy and actions to manage very limited resources available for a lot of these kind of public good or social good domains, where we are trying to maximize the best impact under complex objectives and complex constraints. And so really these real-world application problems become very interesting and very impactful predictive and decision problems. And so as Sarah said, like early on in my career, I really got dedicated to kind of advancing the field of computational sustainability, where really the goal was to kind of advocate and grow a community of AI and computer science researchers more broadly that are really grounded in problems from social impact and sustainability, thinking about how our techniques from AI apply there, but also by looking at these problems in very fine granularity, thinking about how we can improve our methods in order to address those domains. So again, today I'm going to try to give you some examples of things we've done in partnerships in both the predictive as well as the decision side of things. And so without further ado, I have like a very packed agenda of several examples, kind of give you a foray of different things we've done. I'll start with a recent example we've worked on health and well-being. And this is a collaboration with AMREF, which is an NGO that works across Africa in order to promote health, as well as the Kenyan Ministry of Health and our collaborators at Microsoft AI for Good Lab. So what we were doing in this partnership is looking at how to forecast malnutrition hotspots in Kenya. In particular, recently, there's been a lot of advocacy about the problem of acute malnutrition and the need to try to understand better the driving factors and intervene whenever possible. So in particular, in Kenya, malnutrition is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality among children, with over 970,000 children under 5 that are suffering some form of malnutrition in 2023. So this is a pervasive problem. AMREF is one of the organizations on the ground trying to address it by providing food baskets and other nutritional support for families who have children experiencing malnutrition. And so one of the key things that we identified is how can we make their work more effective, again, having limited resources to deploy on the ground, can we facilitate targeting these resources in the most effective way possible? So what we identified as a way to enable that activity is to improve our ability to forecast spatially where would be the hotspots of malnutrition among children with enough in advance in order to allow for responses in terms of providing resources and allocating resources in the right spaces. So we want to basically create a model that's able to predict malnutrition on the sub-county level 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months in advance to allow for organizations like AMREF to then prioritize their resource allocation. So we will work closely with AMREF and the Ministry of Health to collect historical data and identify the modeling problem. So right now, the way that this is done in organizations such as AMREF is to look at the tracking numbers of incidents or prevalence of malnutrition over the previous months and use that as a way to estimate what will happen next. So it's using historical information, but not in automated or a sophisticated way, data-driven, but not any kind of statistical modeling. And obviously, they realize that they are leaving a lot that can be exploited. So basically, we came in and said, okay, can we do this better? So Kenya, like many low-resource and middle-income countries across Africa and other continents, are actually using DHIS2 as a system to manage their health information. And so one thing about this project is that we built it for Kenya with Kenya data, but because it's built on top of DHIS2, which is actually used across many other countries, we're hoping that we can actually expand the footprint of this work across other places with similar challenges. So here we are looking at 4 years of historical data from about 14,000 geotag health facilities, which keep track of the number of cases of malnutrition among children as measured by their mid-upper arm circumference, and then other clinical features like, for example, infant feeding practices, low birth weight, etc. So the idea is, can we use this historical time series of our outcome, which is the malnutrition, as well as clinical features, to be able to forecast ahead of time? So the goal is going to be to predict whether a particular sub-county is within some level of prevalence. So we're going to aggregate data on the sub-county level, summing up all the cases reported across all facilities falling in a particular geographic region, and then tiering that into this kind of predetermined IPC 5-point scale, which classifies levels of prevalence between 0 to 3%, 3 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 30, and above 30, based on a previous classification. Okay, so here I'm going to skip a lot of the details, but here are some of the results by basically combining this historic data on outcome, time series analysis, plus the clinical features. We were able to show that with even simple lightweight models such as logistic regression and gradient boosting trees, we're able to improve the accuracy. This is average AUC across these 5 different class predictions over kind of the baseline, which is window averaging, as a way to kind of quantitatively capture what they're doing right now, which is looking at historical trends of outcomes, of malnutrition outcomes, and using those to predict the future. So as you can see here, window averaging, or just simple statistic historical averaging, fails to predict accurately across the medium to low prevalences of malnutrition, and these more complex nonlinear models like gradient boosting are able to improve that accuracy significantly. So although we haven't, like in this case, invented a brand new methodology, bringing the right AI techniques is actually helping our partners resolve a problem that on the ground has a big impact for them. And so right now we are working closely with the Ministry of Health to try to actually deploy this on a continuous way where they would upload data and forecast every 1 to 3 months and inform their resource allocation respectively. So in addition to these clinical features and historical data, we also wanted to see, well, is it possible to bring different data sources and that are not clinical, that are able to help us make these predictions in situations where, for example, let's say access to this Ministry of Health information, DHIS2, is not accessible. So in particular, we looked at remote sense data, in particular data like MODIS that is collected every 8 days, has relevant outputs like the gross primary productivity, which could be correlated with kind of like food scarcity and food availability over some time windows. So we aggregated GPP-derived statistics on a monthly basis to the sub-county level and used that as a kind of an alternative orthogonal predictor. And we were able to show that actually just based on this like completely data publicly available from another source, we are able to at least match the simple baseline of window averaging, which still requires having access to malnutrition historical time series data. We obviously ideally would want to basically have this data fusion between clinical and additional environmental such as GPP and see which one, how much they can synergize. Preliminary results on that show that at least with enough clinical features, satellite data maybe is not needed to improve accuracy, but I feel like there's actually more to be done in terms of really evaluating in which situations that can fill in unexpected gaps. And just by itself, it's already good to know that it is an alternative source. So for example, with the kind of cut to US aid for some time, for example, DHIS2 and other health data that these organizations were relying to was actually offline. So what happens when suddenly things like this are offline, right? At least maybe you can use like satellite data. Okay, so what's the potential impact of this project is that we're really hoping to improve the efficiency, accuracy, and delivery of nutrition supplements in these vulnerable communities. We are hoping in next steps to actually work closely with AMREF in order to study the kind of like impact on the way that they operate and how many effective deployments of nutrition will happen under this better prediction, and think about how we can integrate the predictive models with operational decisions such as resource allocation, which is very interesting because at the end of the day, we don't just care about predicting malnutrition per se, we want to enable them to make more effective resource allocation. So we're really excited about this to actually have a long-term collaboration on the ground and hopefully expand to other countries as well. I'll switch gears and show you some examples of our work on decision-making for the environment. By the way, happy Earth Day to everybody. I realized that I somehow like serendipitously chose my seminar date. I don't think anybody was doing it on purpose, but it was perfect. In fact, in retrospect, if I had put 2 and 2, I could have done a whole talk just about biodiversity conservation in honor of Earth Day. But I will share a little bit of my work. I have done several different things related to conservation, and I'll talk briefly about 2 of them. One of the leading threats to biodiversity is habitat loss and fragmentation due to anthropogenic pressures such as deforestation, urbanization, agriculture, and overall climate change. And therefore, conservation planning has a critical role to play in protecting key habitat before it gets destroyed. But how do we make these decisions effectively, right? In a data-driven way, and again, use limited resources in the most effective way possible. So a lot of my work has been like bringing optimization models to the conservation communities in terms of conservation planning. And the most recent work that I've done in collaboration with a large team of ecologists and economists is to look at the cost of institutional hierarchies in spatial conservation planning. So what does that mean? That's like a mouthful, right? So as you know, like conservation planning is the problem of like choosing with given some dollars allocated to conservation, which land should I protect in order to maximize some kind of a biodiversity objective, for how many species are expected to persist, etc. And so most of the literature and kind of the research tools available out there are focusing on this problem from kind of a single agent or one-shot decision making, where I'm just saying, okay, I have this money and I'm going to spatially decide which parcels I'm going to buy and evaluate my objective, right? And I want to do this in the most cost-effective way possible. And increasingly, these models are actually really being applied to large-scale spatially explicit initiatives like the 30 by 30 initiative and the key biodiversity areas. However, one thing that's missing is ignoring institutional and governance structures. So usually you don't have that straight connection between conservation dollars and on-the-ground decision making. For example, even in the US, we have like federal government versus states. So instead of using a single planner or acting over a whole region, allocating directly money, or thinking just as broken down multiple independent planners, we really want to take into account this kind of institutional structure, hierarchical structure. So in this work, we basically focused on these collaborative governance structures where we want to explicitly model the layers of interacting conservation actors who might have misaligned, related, but not perfectly identical conservation priorities, right? They might operate on different scales. They, I guess, might have different value systems. They might have different instruments or levers that they can control. So in particular, we're going to look at kind of like the US federal grant giving to states, where the federal government is operating across the whole USA. Their instrument is allocating budgets to states, but not directly maybe protecting specific parcels, and caring about like federally listed species of importance. Versus the states are operating over their own specific region. They actually have the ability to spatially make decisions about conservation priorities within their states, and they might have locally important keystone species and other endangered other species of interest, economic or cultural interest that they want to protect. So there's these related actors working with different instruments at different scales, and yet they have to work together to achieve a final outcome that hopefully is good for everybody. So we can actually model this hierarchical structure, at least for federal versus regional decision-making, or global versus regional decision-making, as a stackable game, where one actor moves first, the leader, and then the others respond. So in our case, the federal government is going to be the leader, allocating budgets to states, and the states are the followers, which, receiving that budget, then make their own decisions, maximizing their local objectives. And essentially, the leader, the government, could endogenize the anticipated behavior of the followers in order to make the best decisions for themselves, right? So if they ignore the fact that these followers are going to be optimizing different objectives than themselves, then they're going to be doing a suboptimum resource allocation. So to express this, you basically can think of it as a bi-level optimization problem, where the leader is optimizing some utility, big U, that is a function of the decisions on the ground that are performed at the lower level by the individual states, individual decision-making. The leader itself is allocating these budgets BR across a whole total budget. So it has these continuous interventions. But at the lower level, each of the states, given a particular budget, is making discrete choices about which land to protect or not, optimizing their own local biodiversity objective. So in particular, in this work, we assume that the utility of both the federal government and of the state governments are related to some kind of ecological persistence factor, but the weight that they put on different species or different ecological factor is different, right? So in particular, the federal government might care about Endangered Species Act species versus the local ones who have local species. So we developed this framework and methodology where we are able to model this problem as a very large-scale mixed integer optimization problem, and we applied at the USA contiguous Would they want to say?
Lower 48.
Yes. Space. So this is basically modeling the giving grants like such as the Land and Water Conservation Fund, federal giving, and the Cooperative Endangered Species Conservation Fund. So again, here our funding decisions will be on the federal level, allocating budgets, on the lower level, individual discrete decisions about which counties are going to get specific land protected within them. And so we actually use as realistic data as possible. We have species distribution models for more than 1,400 terrestrial species across the US, including federally important species from the Threatened and Endangered Species Act, and as well as species that are listed in what's called SWAP plans, or like the state action plans that each individual state has, that includes a much larger list of species. And then we have a cost estimate for acquisition on the county level based on expected returns. So with this real data set across the US, we are able to look at what happens when we ignore versus endogenize this institutional knowledge in decision making. So if we make federal choices, assuming that the federal objective is kind of like the king of all kings, and everybody's going to follow the same lead, the federal government will make an allocation, something like that, where they would directly, if they were able to decide whether to protect land in order to maximize ESA species. However, this is not achievable because the federal government is not directly able to work on the spatial level. So they're still going to have to allocate budgets, and then the states are going to take those budgets and make their own local decisions. So then when the corresponding states' budgets are allocated, they're allocated then to different counties than what was expected in that idealized solution. So the actual realized solution of the budget allocation that ignores institution will shift the expected decisions, and then the realized objective in terms of federally listed species will be lower. So that's kind of like the price of ignoring institutions, essentially. You can think of that, the difference between what the federal government would have expected to be the outcome for the ESA species, assuming that everybody's going to be exactly prioritizing the same species as them, versus what happens on the ground when the misaligned priorities are realized. So by using our endogenized Stackelberg game model, which endogenizes that misalignment when in allocating budgets, we are able to do something smarter. Okay, so the bi-level approach accounts for the state decision making in the federal budget allocation, and basically is able to allocate budgets to states that are more aligned in their objectives with the federal ESA species. So in terms of quantitative results, you can think about this as at best, if the federal government was able to swoop in and make spatially explicit decision, they can achieve some idealized maximum. But when it gets realized with a misalignment, in our analysis, it basically loses about 24% of the expected biodiversity outcomes. But then when you come in and you do the Stackelberg bi-level method, we're able to then recover that by at least 1/3 back to expected or anticipated biodiversity outcomes. So again, endogenizes institutions is allowing to take into account this misalignment and empower the federal government to make more informed decisions. Yeah.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So I think this is really, really cool work, and particularly this like sort of difference in terms of like decision making at different scales feels really important in these spaces. But I guess it does kind of make the assumption that the best solution is the idealized solution based on the Endangered Species Act. But the Endangered Species Act doesn't list a huge number of threatened species because the process of listing a species is so political. Mm-hmm. And so actually some of those state-based allocations might actually be better along some different dimensions of biodiversity. Did you look at all at how these different solutions might measure for like different metrics of like biodiversity sort of improvement or gain?
Yeah, definitely. So we basically have this like plots where it's looking at like, oh, what is like, the ESA only biodiversity versus the combined biodiversity across all species, let's say the SWAP plants make, and essentially these different approaches are at different points of the Pareto curve among them. And often, in fact, depending on the misalignment, ignoring institutions is really like Pareto dominated in a sense. It would almost sometimes be like worse in both cases.
Interesting.
Because it's already clear here, like in a sense, the federal government will lose so much by not taking into account the misalignment that it will get worse response than it will just, let's say, optimizing for the swap species and still getting a benefit for the federally listed species. But the bigger overarching question is like, are the objectives that we are modeling the right ones? And that's obviously a much bigger question. But one can argue that, but in all cases, at some point, all of these actors will have to agree on whatever they feel like is the objective they want to optimize. And at that point, it still makes sense to think about this institutional dynamics. There will always, unless you're thinking like, oh, I can convince everybody to agree on a single objective that's shared among all of them, which I feel like it's unlikely, right? And there's obviously the power dynamics about, no, but I'm on top, therefore I have my own objective. It should dominate other things. Yeah.
What's going on with the remaining 2/3? And a related question is, do you model like gaming of the of what the follower is doing, like saying that they want to be what the leader?
Both very good questions. So the first one is the fact that there's some of the ESA species are in areas where essentially there's very little other species that anybody cares about. So in a sense, they're just like, when you look at what states will decide, they just never decide to go and protect land there. So that's just because of the spatial distribution of some of these species. And the second one is very relevant. So right now, in a sense, we've gone one step further in modeling kind of like the player dynamics in this hierarchical structure. But obviously, there's much more complex things. Like, for example, they could be gaming, but they're also like more importantly is more like how about cooperation? Right, so a lot of neighboring, bordering states actually share a lot of their species in their swaps because there's overlapping habitat ranges. So there's actually interest for them to coordinate to protect those species that they both care about. And so in this current model I'm presenting is actually not taking into account, in a sense, lost opportunity of coordination on the state level. So that's actually something that we're exploring now, and we're hoping to come up with some frameworks. Obviously, it becomes more and more complex as you think about like more of the agent dynamics. But as a first step, that was one way to integrate the institutional dynamics. But definitely very, very, both in terms of gaming and in terms of cooperation, wide open areas that for additional improvement. Okay. And so in conservation, the second biggest threat after habitat fragmentation and loss is biodiversity loss due to wildlife poaching, trafficking, and trade. It threatens animal populations, but it also threatens other sustainable development goals like and threatens ecotourism, security, and health. And so I think many people don't realize the scale at which illegal wildlife trafficking is actually pervasive. It's like a huge multi-billion-dollar industry happening globally across the world. And so IWT refers to basically the poaching, like killing or taking out of their natural habitat of animals, and then trafficking them to other locations wherever the markets are. And it threatens a lot of, it affects a lot of species that are highly threatened and endangered. And they're often like collected either because there's a demand for them as pets, alive, or for their skins or other products, or traditional medicine, for example. So there's many different demands. Often I get asked like, oh, but why? Or like where exactly, who are the people or the communities that demand it? It's a very multifaceted economy with different supply and demand factors. So actually understanding what is happening, how it's happening, and how we can intervene is critical, and yet it's very difficult because very little data is collected. I feel like habitat modeling and species modeling is way ahead of the curve in terms of data collection and modeling efforts, while IWT is this like gray zone where it's illegal in some countries, not in others. Data is not collected in a coherent way, and there's really not enough light being shown on this really important conservation problem. Obviously, though, a lot of organizations, conservation organizations, are trying to quantify the scale and mechanism and impact of IWT, and there's like reports that are trying to collect data and identify some of those trends. But most of the reports that are out there, such as reports by the UN, aggregate observed incidents and basically present raw IWT historical trends. And that's obviously better than not having quantitative analysis, but hopefully we can do better than just counting, right, in order to understand driving factors and so on. And the problem with just counting is that the data on which this is based, which is seizures, right, seizures of illegal wildlife trafficking, which is, again, kind of criminal data, it suffers from detection bias, representation bias, and completeness bias. So this severely hinders our ability to kind of address and understand what's happening. So coming from this motivation, we wanted to see whether we can use predictive modeling based on this historic data to somehow help identify features that make certain locations more likely to be engaged in illegal wildlife trafficking activities, and also try to fill in some of the gaps by being able to predict undetected hotspots. And so we chose to do this on the global airline network because airline IWT seizures is one of the better documented kind of infrastructures where IWT happens. Obviously, there's other modes, but air is one of the main ones. And so the first thing we did is to collect as much data as we could. So based on kind of like publicly or like by request data access, we were able to aggregate 1,300 wildlife trafficking incidents across the world on the airport network. And as you can see here, just in terms of, again, the raw statistics, you can see that there's certain hotspots of many incidents being reported. Again, this is with keeping in mind the fact that reporting is incomplete. And so just at face value might also be missing some part of the story. So we use this data in a predictive model to try to understand how these historical IWT seizures relate to features of the airport at which the seizures were either confiscated or the recorded origin or destination for that particular trafficking incident. So we are using any kind of all the airports implicated in IWT, not just the seizure location. And so in this model, we incorporate airport features that vary by location, so looking at kind of like structural components of centrality metrics of the airports within the global airline network, right? So that's kind of like structural network properties, but then sustainable development metrics such as indices reported on criminal markets, criminal actors, and resilience. And so here you can see, based on the models we developed, some Shapley feature importance, which identifies the fact that structural properties within the network obviously drive a lot of the choices. Airports with high network centrality are very likely to be chosen. They have a lot of edges and a lot of ways to like go to different locations, but other things also matter. In particular, in our analysis, doing prediction only based on structural properties was much worse in terms of accuracy than incorporating some of the other factors like fauna crimes and state actors, territorial integrity, etc. So basically, this model is allowing us to kind of dig further into the driving factors that might not be understood before.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. You do have information about the prevalence of certain species in geographies, and also what kind of markets or what kind of products and where these are sold in terms of these species, and if these are actually killed or used for some other uses, right? So the markets,
I mean, there's some information, but I don't think there's very nicely compiled information on the markets. On the species, yes. Although the data, the IWT data is so sparse that here we were actually aggregating across all the species. We didn't try to divide it by, let's say, because then our data set becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Ideally, we would want that, because if we are actually modeling, let's say, the trafficking of a specific species or like a family of related species, we could use information about like where are they even present. So definitely we kind of know what the supply areas, right? And we could exploit that in our prediction. And hopefully we can do that with more information on as seizure data becomes more and more reported. But
do you have information on lax laws, like local laxity of enforcement laws, and do you incorporate that in the...
Yeah, so some of these metrics are exactly measuring that. Like, for example, how the strength of like law enforcement in the countries in which the airports are. It also, one of the features is like, are they part of CITES, which is this like global consortium about commitment to fight illegal wildlife trade. We put as many of these things as possible. Many of these features are kind of on the country level as opposed to on the airport level. So we also try to incorporate airport-specific things like the population of the city that it's in, like other characteristics of that location and so on. So we try to put in, we didn't know what the driving factors are, so originally we were trying to be broad, but again, we have to keep into account that the data set is small, so at some point you start overfitting as well. Okay, and so then the other thing that was really interesting to see is the false positive of this model, right? Knowing that there is like detection bias and so on, actually a lot of these false positive, by talking to experts in the IWT community, are really not false. They're just places where IWT incidents are not being reported very well, right? Like there's either no commitment to report that much or for other reasons. So it was very interesting to use the model to also basically something that you can do beyond just doing like, again, what's in most reports so far is just kind of like data representation of what historically observed, but once you have a model, you can actually extrapolate and do this kind of predictive analysis. So interestingly enough, a lot of these airports are in countries which have already been identified as high IWT activities. Just some airports essentially don't have good inspections, so IWT activity has not been reported there, although it's likely to be occurring. And other countries like the US is not on the naughty list, but because the US makes the naughty list. So somehow it doesn't appear on its own list of countries that participate in IWT, although it's actually a known fact in the community that there is a supply draw from our own country. And so I'm not going to say about research, but I wanted to briefly mention, if anybody's interested, we have related to this like a very large-scale ongoing project that I'm super excited about called Operation Pangolin, which is funded by the Paul Allen Family Foundation, which is a multidisciplinary, multi-pronged approach of trying to understand wildlife trafficking, kind of grounded in pangolin wildlife trafficking. Pangolins are the most trafficked animal in the world. In the last decade, there's been estimated more than 1 million pangolins as being trafficked, and demand is increasing. And so this is a collaboration between technology developers, like our collaborators from Arivada, who developed new biomonitoring sensors, like new camera traps, etc., ecologists and conservation criminologists, socioeconomic experts, and conservation institutions such as ZSL and AI expertise. And what we are hoping to do is, by bringing all of our disciplines together, understand where the pangolins are, their ecology, how are they being poached and trafficked, and what are like kind of the local community's attitude and alternative livelihoods, and how we can facilitate better understanding, but also better intervention in reducing illegal wildlife trade of pangolins. So this is like an ongoing project where we're hoping to make a real impact on the ground, but also learn about and create a framework of how to approach IWT research from this multidisciplinary approach. because a lot of these things are usually done in verticals. There's a lot of ecology and biomonitoring studies. There's a lot of socioeconomic studies. There's a lot of like kind of just criminology. And actually, we really want to identify the data fusion and kind of data synergy and analysis synergy opportunities across disciplines to achieve something bigger than the sum of the parts. And so as a conclusion, I guess on the IWT part, I really want to emphasize again, it's a huge problem that is, I think, not as broadly understood as, like, let's say, biodiversity and climate change is, but illegal wildlife trade is a huge industry, and understanding and preventing it not only helps biodiversity, but also a lot of other sustainable development factors such as biological invasion, zoonotic diseases, other serious crime, and ecotourism and other sustainable development investments. And here AI and OR can help us, as I showed examples of using predictive models, but we also can think about decision things like about where should we be, for example, monitoring, where should we be having more deterrence, such as inspections on airports, etc. So both predictive ML models and OR models can help this fight. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Yes, I have another 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think we started pretty late.
Yeah.
But we could go a little over. I understand.
So I've given an example of like how AI can help public health, and how AI can be used to inform biodiversity conservation efforts. This is like a foray of the different application areas that I feel passionate about. The next one I want to talk about is an example of the kind of research that can inform disaster resilience. Again, within disaster resilience, my group has worked on things like optimizing prescribed burn to minimize wildfire risks, modeling human migration and other sea level rise, and some of the work I'm going to share with you today, disaster mitigation planning for infrastructure resilience. So we've looked at road fortification against flooding, as well as water infrastructure fortification against earthquakes. So in particular, critical infrastructure systems, as you know, are very vulnerable to natural disasters. Unclear what is happening. No, I just decided to go to sleep for 30 seconds. They obviously have service disruptions which impact disaster response. They have impact on long-term and medium-term recovery, as well as economic impacts in terms of cost of repairs and loss of productivity. And disaster response is obviously very important. But ideally, we want to take actions before disaster strikes. Like, what can we do ahead of time in order to minimize the possible impact when inevitably there's like a hurricane or an earthquake, etc. So I'm really a very strong kind of passionate proponent on proactive investments in resilience efforts such as disaster mitigation. And so I actually purposefully try to connect to Los Angeles agencies in order to understand what can I do to help them make LA more resilient. And Los Angeles was actually at the forefront, some 6-7 years ago, where they actually have like a very sophisticated, ambitious resilient plans. It was one of the 100 Resilient Cities initiative, if you remember. And so they actually put a lot of thought into what can be done. And one of the goals that was identified, since Los Angeles is exposed to many earthquakes, is to really try to think about how can we fortify our water network in order to minimize negative impacts in the event of a disaster. So they committed to this kind of initiative called Seismic Resilient Pipe Network, where LA was going to fortify part of the water infrastructure with like special pipes that are less likely to break during the earthquake, in order to make sure that critical customers like hospitals and evacuation centers and fire stations actually have water after or during the disaster in order to facilitate the response. But, okay, this plan was there. Now, how do you actually do it? And so one of their chief engineers back in 2017, who was kind of the mastermind behind this resilience goal, really identified the fact that the proper layout of this investment fortification has to allow the network to be resilient in a cost-effective way, but actually this is like a very complex, spatially explicit network design problem that they didn't have the right tools to do. So the two of us connected in around 2018. I was like, well, this is the kind of stuff I know how to do, combinatory optimization, network design. Their plan was to basically put engineers to be responsible for 2 by 2 mile pieces of the city. Each engineer looks at the 2 by 2 mile piece, decides what to be upgraded, and then moves on to the other one, and then they stitch it all together. Now, when you're thinking about resilience, making localized decision on 2 by 2 mile and then stitching them all together is doomed not to be resilient. But they didn't have the computational tools to be thinking about anything larger scale than 2 by 2 miles. So we basically work closely with them to understand what are the constraints, what are the objectives, and how to model this problem mathematically in a way that can scale up. And LA is particularly difficult because it's like, I think, the largest single service area across the country. It's like 473 square miles, 4 million residents, with a high hazard percentage, like 30% of customers and pipes are actually exposed to earthquake risk. So you have a large portion of the network that potentially you can choose to upgrade. So these are still like many, many pipes, but you have only limited budget to do them. So here is the formalization of the network fortification problem that we were able to formalize. So what you need to do is, given a water network and seismic risk maps that basically identify some of the pipes that could be exposed to earthquake breakage, you want to select a subset of these pipes such that all critical customers, which are nodes in this network, must be directly connected to this fortified network consisting of either upgraded pipes or pipes that at zero risk of breakage, while at the same time providing overall coverage such that every resident, so every parcel within the city, is within 1 mile of that backbone fortified network. 1 mile, this is basically, they want to make sure that in the event of an earthquake, a fire hose can be connected to a functioning water provision and reach like a building that might be on fire due to the earthquake effects, right? So we have this kind of a complex problem, very large network with both these critical customer constraints as well as the coverage constraints. So the data, basically, we had a non-disclosure agreement with LIDWP. They actually gave us the real water infrastructure network, their critical customers. We got GS information from USGS on the earthquake hazards, and we basically created this optimization problem. So what does the optimization problem look like? We basically have this network in which edges are the pipes, the nodes are basically the connections between the different pipes, and we have the cost of choosing any edge or any pipe to be upgraded. And that cost depends on how long the pipe is, what's the diameter, like how much material it has, and other things like how difficult it is to dig it out, how old it is, etc. So they had a way of determining this cost. Sorry. We have a set of nodes that are the water sources, the set of critical customers that we want to make sure that we reach, and then these coverage constraints, which basically for every residential area say, okay, at least one of the pipes within 1 mile radius better be part of that fortified network. And we are hoping to find basically the minimum cost solution that satisfies all of these resilience constraints. And so this becomes this complex Steiner network problem with coverage constraints. So Steiner network problems are well studied, but here we have this additional coverage constraint which makes the problem even harder. So we had to obviously try to figure out how to model it and how to solve these problems. I'm going to skip in the interests of time, but part of this is in order to get to something that is actually you can put it in an optimization solver. We also had to think about how to contract the network representation. For example, large portions of the network are not at risk, so they become like a hypernode that then gets shrunk. And so all of pre-processing techniques in order to make the optimization models solvable. Well, solvable still in a matter of many, many hours. So we developed this model and the techniques to solve it, and we were able to provide solutions to them which were, according to our estimation, between 6 to 23% most cost-effective than like something that would look like more like the stitching that they were planning to do. And with some smart back-end pre-processing and post-processing optimization, we were able to make this scalable enough for us to be able to address this problem. Yet these problems are really, really hard to solve. I don't want to underestimate this, especially as you want to increase the size. So in the beginning, we were like, okay, we can promise you that you can do at most like a service zone. So there's like, I think about like 300 service zones across the LA. So it's divided into sub areas. Then we're like, you know what? We actually can do it better. We can do like a district size. And then by the end, we were actually able to solve really large portions at once, which means the bigger the spatial extent that you plan for, the more cost-effective solution you find, right? So because you're actually seeing the bigger context of the decisions. Yes?
So this formulation doesn't allow for what we call these non-network solutions. In other words, to have a lot of distributed small resources and locations. Smaller households or neighborhoods and so forth. It just sort of brute force is the solution of the grid. You solve it all. So.
I'm not sure I understand. Can you repeat the question?
There is a lot of Internet of Things. You can put a little water well in your neighborhood rather than build the big.
Oh yeah. Like in a sense.
I think this is sort of a traditional way of optimizing the grid in a centralized way?
Yes, yeah. So this doesn't take into account other interventions. So here the only intervention we are modeling is that we are fortifying the existing water, like centralized lifeline infrastructure. There could be an alternative or additional intervention, which could be like, I put local water sources that will provide.
And
so
power infrastructure in particular, that's a huge area for us, that we can do a lot of distributed energy resources, little solar and this and that, rather than just build a network. I think it's a huge question about the trade-offs. I don't know in water, what is the trade-off?
We haven't looked at it, but this is very insightful comment, because obviously there would be like some parallel interventions and infrastructure choices that one can make that are not just upgrading. That hasn't been considered. I guess we were mostly following their lead in terms of what they were thinking and helping them solve the problem that they had identified. But even just from like a water infrastructure, like civil engineering perspective, they could think of additional things that they want to model explicitly. Especially thinking that from an optimization perspective, once you have the basic model, actually adding these extra choices is not that hard. That's the beauty of using something like mixed integer programming models, where like adding side constraints is not, it's pretty easy as opposed to like a custom solution.
But it's more like gaming. It's more than just centralized anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different problem. And I think you made a comment that if you do from bottom up, you're always going to be losing. That is with new technologies. I'm not convinced that that's really the answer.
Well, I think this is a different aspect. I think you can have local interventions, like for example, putting community, cisterns or something like that. You could still plan for those things at a global level, like as the LIDWP, in a sense, as the caretaker of this, can still plan the allocation of those community resources, not necessarily. Otherwise, you would have to like simulate individual neighborhood choices to do that or not. Yeah, that's more like an emergent resilience. I agree. And obviously, like, you can go beyond just the optimum solution. You can be thinking about additional metrics in terms of, like, who is affected and how much. If you're not able to cover all of the critical customers, and just counting, for example, like some resilience metric without looking at the spatial distribution of benefits might be problematic as well. So there's, like, additional variants that one can think of. I saw a hand up.
My question was just actually related to this. I was going to ask if there was a prediction step to this, or if the risk types or portions of the network were deterministic and, like.
In this analysis, there were, like, basically we're using the USGS hazard layers, but obviously one can think about, like, okay, these hazard layers are some kind of aggregate of a portfolio of possible, earthquake scenarios. You could explicitly think about in, like, a portfolio of scenarios as opposed to one aggregate layer, or you could even think about, like, predictions and so on. And these are all, like, fair game for more sophisticated, more detailed analysis of this decision making. I agree. And so this, I guess, through this foray of applications, I'm giving you several examples that I hope have illustrated how both machine learning and operations research approaches have an immense role to play in addressing some of these pressing societal problems. And there's a large scope of things to do, especially when you work closely with NGOs and local agencies to understand the problems and objectives and constraints they need to face, and identify, like, fit for purpose solutions. I'm a very big believer about, like, really grounding these applications in real partnerships. It's a two-way street. We can provide useful models and algorithms and solutions to them, but often they identify really important challenges to our field, the algorithmic field, that push us to try to innovate and then therefore enriches our own discipline. And I don't know, it seems like I'm not going to have time, but I was going to tell you, like, on the method side, what this has meant for me is, like, basically a lot of these optimization problems that arise in solving infrastructure resilience problems and so on are really hard to solve. They're large scale, and current solvers for these mathematical problems really cannot scale and solve them. So then this pushed this agenda about how can we scale up discrete optimization solvers to these more realistic real-world problems, which made me work on the integration of machine learning and optimization from a methods perspective, speeding up algorithms for solving mixed integer optimization problems by using machine learning inside the algorithmic approaches themselves, where we're learning automatically from the behavior of the solver new heuristics and algorithmic design principles that then allow us to solve these problems faster or find better solution in quicker time. So I have this whole other talk that I can talk about how we combine. So I've shown you examples of individual machine learning and optimization for this application-driven research. But when we combine machine learning and optimization to actually solve these real-world problems, it's a really, really exciting methodological area that I'm very passionate about. And so if you're curious, ask me after the talk, because I'm not going to have time to talk about it. Thank you so much.